George Devol's favorite place was his garage in Connecticut, where ideas percolated and inventions were born.
George Devol was a serial inventor. He was a guy who chose not to go to college because he was so brilliant that he was capable of making a living just by coming up with inventions on his own.
By the mid-1950s, George had helped invent all sorts of devices, such as the phantom doorman that used a photoelectric cell to open doors.
George Devol was kind of a nerdy guy who was really focused on the details. You know, he wasn't thinking about the big picture. He was really focused on how his inventions actually worked. And not so much on whether people would want to use them or what the applications were or anything like that, which is why he wasn't the greatest businessman.
While looking through a technical journal, he saw an assembly line, an image of monotony that set his imagination working. George wondered, why should human beings have to do such mind-numbing work?
You're doing that job again and again and again. And once you do it all day, human beings just lose concentration. And losing concentration meant that you could get injured, and people did.
George thought that if something else were to do all the repetitive work, the workers' lives would be improved. If that tool were to move similar to the human arm, grab onto things and lift them up, its possible uses would be mind-boggling.
It had to be able to pick up heavy parts. It had to be dexterous, so it had to be able to get a hold of those parts and hang on to them and move them to another place and let go of them.
George pictured a machine that had a wrist that could bend and rotate similar to a real hand, with two opposing fingers to do the grasping. The arm's actions would be controlled by a computer, which could be reprogrammed for different jobs. George obtained a patent, but he was unable to find anyone to listen to his idea.
He's really focused on details, he's really technically proficient, but he's not really very good at explaining what he's doing to anyone else.
His break came by chance at a friend's party.
George. George Devol, I'd like you to meet Joe Engelberger. I have a feeling you boys have a lot to talk about.
George, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Joe.
I think we need a drink. Can we get a couple more?
Joe Engelberger was an engineer with a background in physics, who was also a very sharp businessman.
So, George, what line of work are you in?
Well, see, I have this idea.
The two get to talking, and Joe suddenly realizes that what George is describing is something that he's read about in science fiction, only it's real, a robot.
Very interesting.
Joe spotted the huge business potential and all the possible uses for a robotic arm. It was the beginning of a fruitful relationship.
Come on in, Joe. This is it. I know it doesn't look like much, but we can clean all this stuff out of here.
George concentrated on building a working prototype and solving engineering problems that arose. Joe began to identify all the potential uses and buyers for a robotic arm.
He was going to factories and he was trying to figure out the lowest hanging fruit. Where can robots help first? So he was trying to identify really important jobs for robots. And that means jobs that people don't want to do.
One of their biggest engineering challenges was how to adjust the robot's grip so it was adaptable for different tasks. The solution was to install pressure sensors inside the machine's hand. The heavier the pressure, the stronger the grip was needed to be. The robot's movements were programmed into a computer.
You just move it through the motions, and then it would record that, and then it would play it back again and again and again, all night long, never going to sleep, never asking for a break.
The prototype was called the Unimate. The duo continued to refine and test it, proving that their invention was adaptable to a multitude of tasks. It seemed as if success was inevitable. But George and Joe had not counted on the image that robots had in the US.
At the time, robots were just like witches or werewolves. They were completely made up. It was just like any other boogeyman that was used to scare people in a story. When robots appeared in popular culture, they were typically killing everybody. So this is a tremendously difficult business problem.
The US's lack of enthusiasm was disappointing. George and Joe had to expand their horizons. And in Japan, the post-war economy was booming.
In Japan, robots were much better perceived. And so there was no drawback for the Japanese companies to tell everybody, hey, we've got robots.
Japanese car manufacturers began to use Unimates, and productivity boomed. The rest of the world took note, and the robot revolution began.
This was a real turning point for humankind, because one minute we were just using tools, and the next minute we were letting our tools do their jobs on their own, completely autonomously.
In 2003, the Unimate was inducted into the Robot Hall of Fame. But it was George and Joe who deserved the real credit for working out that almost anything could be made with a robot.